Now we're going to talk about Ferndale in four, let's see if this works, yes? In four periods. The location of first ownership, the quiet rural period, the lively 30s guest house days and a mysterious fire linked to Gladys Sanford, and then subsequent owners up to today. Two persons of wider significance in the story are John Booth and Gladys Sanford. I guess you can tell which is which. John was the original owner, so really you could call this Ferndale the house that Jack built. Gladys was employed at Ferndale in the 1930s as manager. She was an adventurous, flamboyant woman who flew aeroplanes and drove rally cars. But we'll get to her in a while. Firstly, the location. Here's an early view of the Ferndale property. And then this photo shows the original two-storey house that was built in 1894. We don't know when this photo was taken. I think it may have been the guest house period. As well, there was a separate three-bedroom servants' quarters that was built behind the main house. Okay, so the location. Do you all know where? Have you all been down Old Ferndale Road, up Ferndale Road to Old Argyle Road? Who doesn't know where we're talking about? All right, well, I've got a couple of maps, but let's try and explain. Let's get the pointer. Here's Bundanoon, Ferndale Road. Old Argyle Road. Up here, Sutton Forest, Illawarra Highway. Old Argyle Road comes off the Illawarra Highway, winds around and meets at a T-junction, Ferndale Road. It carries on what is now a fire trail down to Penrose. And Ferndale is, I think it's here or there, okay? It's located on the Old Argyle Road, a few kilometres from Bundanoon. The old road, this old road, dates back to around 1820. So now I'll go to the next slide. This map here is really early. It's by the way, let me say, what I'm giving here is just some stories about Ferndale. This is not an official history. I'm not an official historian. I'm just an amateur. But hopefully this is enjoyable stories. Things like title deeds and so on I haven't gone into. But this is very historic. This is an extract from an 1837 New South Wales map showing part of Throsby's, that's Dr. Charles Throsby, explorer. The red line is his road that he explored and built, which was the first south road that ended up going towards Goulburn. Here it's going out through Canyon Lee. Coming down here is the blue line, it's called the Means Traverse, that went to Bungonia. And that was really the first south road. They didn't know. Before Goulburn existed, Bungonia was going to be the place where people lived in the south. But as you know, things changed later on. So what I'm trying to say is, in 1919, Governor Macquarie instructed Throsby to build a cart road from Picton to Bong Bong, Sutton Forest and beyond. Throsby decided to build his road out there. Means Road became the track that settlers were using. Now that's important because settlers took up along that area. By the late 1820s, the village was flourishing at Sutton Forest and settlement took place along the first part of Means Route, which is now the Old Argyle Road, in an area known as Jumping Rock. So by the 1830s, surveyor Thomas Mitchell laid out a new line of road that became the Great Southern Road and the Hume Highway. So if I go back to, how do I go back to this slide? Maybe it makes more sense now that up here is where Throsby's Road went out there, Means Road came down here. So this was the first road that went to Bungonia. And it was settled all along here, Jumping Rock, settlers took up. Now, while I'm on this, before we get back to, I'm moving away from Ferndale for a minute to give the history of this area. This Argyle track became a major route, as I said. Now, last year, our council closed this section, which was a fire trail. You could take bikes down, you could ride, you could take horses down, you could walk down there, all the way into the forestry area. Last year, council closed that section to vehicles and passed it to the New South Wales Rural Fire Service to upgrade and maintain. But the reserve remains accessible to pedestrians for bushwalking, bicycle riding and horse riding. Some undocumented heritage is associated with, now I go on to here. What I'm working towards explaining are these. The convict range. You've all been out and seen the convict range? So does it mean anything to anyone? Some people, okay. They're not really much. You have to really look to even see, but they're man-made and they're located there. Here's Ferndale Road. So Ferndale is up out here. I'm talking about these two bits of road of the fire trail. Here's the old original road, and it's there. So from the 1820s, travellers were going down that road. It was pretty rough, horse and carts and so on. And it rained. As we know, it rains around here. The road flooded. They built these stone drains to help a bit. But obviously from this, which is a later section, this steep part here got washed out too much, so they built a further road. And that remained in use for the settlers down Bungonia way until the 1860s probably, 1850s. But you know, as I showed on the map, by then most traffic was going down what became the Hume Highway, the Old South Road, and Goulburn was established rather than Bungonia. So by the time we're now getting back to our Ferndale story, jumping ahead to once the railway had come through and Bundanoon started developing, Bundanoon and other Southern Highland centres became popular with holiday makers. In the early 1880s, the New South Wales Governor established a summer residence at Sutton Forest, and many of Sydney's elite families followed suit. One such resident was John Booth. There he is. He had arrived in the colony in 1839 as a cabin boy and went on to establish a highly successful sawmill and timber business at Balmain. He and wife Susanna raised 4 sons and 7 daughters. There's the 4 sons. Now, sometime in the early 1890s, Booth purchased a 780-acre property on the old Argyle Road. So here we are, another map, same road. Here's Bundanoon, Ferndale Road, and this is the old Argyle Road. And that is Booth's original property, all of that. So you can see it extends down along that section where the convict drains are. and it shrank. As you'll see, over the years it shrank, but originally it was pretty big property. He built a substantial two-storey residence which featured a fine exterior with wide verandas and front porch, Gothic, perhaps. The house consisted of 12 bedrooms. 12 bedrooms? But yeah, when you look at the back, you would have fitted 12 bedrooms. They would have been fairly small. An enormous withdrawing room, a dining room capable of seating 32, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen, pantry and laundry, all under the one roof, with a large amount of cedar fittings. As well, there was an outbuilding and a 3-room cottage which served as servants' quarters, as already mentioned. Booth's sawmill business provided employment, so he built that place. Here is a Merlin photo, very early, 1870, of his works at Balmain. He employed hundreds of people, hundreds of workers. He became the first mayor of Balmain in 1867 and was a member of the New South Wales Legislative Assembly for 5 years. It's written that he didn't quite get on. He was a cabin boy. He was uneducated. He was a self-made man and didn't always, and spoke his mind, it seems to be, and didn't always get on with the other people in the assembly. However, he did very well in business, and after more than 40 years in control of his company, he resigned on the 1st of April 1896, placing his son in charge. There. What brought Booth to the Southern Highlands? He was in his 70s, in the 1890s, and perhaps worn out by his business. I hope the great-great-grandson over there, do you agree? He was perhaps worn out by his business and financial concerns and sought a bit of a rest. Perhaps he built up the property as a holiday home for his wife. So here we have the 4 sons and the daughters, all in that photo. 6 daughters and 4 sons. So maybe it was a holiday home for the whole family, with children and numerous grandchildren. That's why he built a house with 12 bedrooms. As well, perhaps he was a businessman. Perhaps it was a canny investment during the uncertain financial times of the 1890s. Another question we ponder: who built the house and what material did he use? They're his workers in Balmain. Did he bring some of them up, and did he bring the timber up? We don't know, but what we do know is once the house was finished, Booth only enjoyed the property for 2 years. He died there in 1898, aged 77. He was survived by his wife, Susanna, the sons and daughters, and the grandchildren, who lived on, and then only a few years later, in 1903, the family sold the property. So that's really the Booth period. What came after that? Well, after 1903, Ferndale subsequently went through several ownerships, about which we don't know a lot, but from the local Scrutiny newspaper and the Sydney Morning Herald, we've pieced together a bit of a history. As you can see there, it was to let in 1902, and then a new owner in 1903 was Mr. Henderson. What's this? 18. Here's some notice placed in the news. Can you read that? Yeah, don't go shooting on Ferndale. So what's happening? It's up for auction. Got a few cows on the place, heifers and steers. Good dairy bull. Okay. Then in ducks for sale. So as you can see from here, the place is operating as a rural estate. Then in 1913, this report indicates that William Lindsay, aged 68, had settled down at Ferndale. Was he the owner? Sorry, that's a bit blurred and it's all a bit vague. I just put it in to show that things kept changing there. Here now in 1917, it's for sale again. Then in 1919, new owner, Mrs. C. Barnett, advertised it as a rural retreat. Was a cars, meets, train by arrangement, horses, guns, track, car, good cuisine, every comfort, beautiful climate. So a rural retreat, it's kind of like it's becoming a guest house. Then in 1920, it's for sale as a home for the retired squatter. Then in 1921 and 23, for sale again. So I don't know what this says about the time, but I guess there's a lot of coming and going. Properties sold around here. But anyway, it settled down. After this, we move into the 1930s, when it's now billed as a pleasure ranch. So it's not the place for the squatter, it's a pleasure ranch. So here, we're now in the 1930s, and here's the first guest house advertisement for Ferndale that appeared in the Herald in that decade. Dated December 1933, describes the place as a glorious 1,000-acre pleasure ranch with all the amenities listed. By this time, Mr. Frank Knight and his wife were the owners. They employed Mrs. Gladys Sanford to manage the place, and a farm labourer, Anthony Regan, as caretaker. He lived in the cottage, and she, apparently Gladys, lived in Bundanoon. And that's when I think maybe this photo dates from, but I'm not sure. I show it again because I will read from the Goulburn Evening Penny Post, September 1934. Here's a description of one evening at this pleasure ranch. On Saturday last, one of the most enjoyable evenings of the year was held at Ferndale Guest House, the spacious building being provided for the occasion by Mrs. Sanford. The rooms were beautifully decorated and the large gathering was made to feel at home. The proceeds were in aid of the Ladies' Auxiliary and the Returned Soldiers' League, and the secretaries were ably assisted by Mrs. Sanford in the numerous duties. Mr. Clive Greenaway was in charge of the card games. In the ladies' section, a play-off between Mrs. McDowell, partnered by Mrs. Snell, against Mrs. Greenaway and Miss Westbury was necessary and resulted in a win for the latter pair. Mr. Burtvoller won the men's prize. Dancing was most popular to the rhythm supplied on the piano by Miss Westbury, and thrilling interludes were provided by Sydney theatre artists who were holidaying at Ferndale. Mrs. Grice, on behalf of the Ladies' Auxiliary, thanked all those who had assisted. He made special reference to Mrs. Sanford, Miss Westbury, Mr. Franks on the drums, and Mr. Knight for the use of his car. All very social and respectable, but the lively dancing, gambling, and no doubt drinking were perhaps frowned upon by some of the more staid locals. So at the time, let's just look at in this. I've extracted from that listing. Now here's Ferndale, and you can see persons accommodated 8, compared to, look at these, the other guest houses, these ones 20, 30, and down here the Knoll 80, the Knoll accommodated 80, 50 at Rosnell, whereas Ferndale was 8. Tariff, the most expensive tariff is 70 shillings a week for the golf house. Ferndale is 63, so it's the second most expensive. The Knoll, well, the Knoll's pretty dear, pretty up there. So you can see Ferndale was small, exclusive, and expensive. So once again, the Ferndale property was listed for sale by auction in 1936. This time it states that the property comprises about 400 acres of arable land, an up-to-date guest house plus more features. So 1 minute's 1,000 acres, then it's 400 acres. We do know that parts of it were sold off, but we'll come to that. Next thing, fire. So it was up for sale. It was still owned by Mr. Knight. Gladys was still manager. On Wednesday morning, 20th of January 1937, the police received a telephone call from Mrs. Sanford informing them that the main house at Ferndale had burnt down during the night. Okay? This is where the mystery starts. It was still owned by Mr. Knight, who had accumulated debts and who owed money to Gladys and to numerous Bundanoon tradespeople. Knight and his wife claimed to be in Strathfield at the time of the fire. Although circumstances were suspicious and evidence mounted against Gladys, she managed to clear her name. At the summation of the Mossvale Coroner's inquiry, the magistrate found that Ferndale had been destroyed by fire, but he could not say how the fire started. The matter then remained unresolved. The culprit or cause was never discovered, although for long afterwards people believed that Gladys had simply emptied the Ferndale residence of its expensive furniture and fittings, then set fire to it. Because we do know some of the fittings, the curtains and things turned up later. Didn't they, Helene? The house, so there it is. When you go out there today, you'll see this, it's still there. The house was insured for £2,250 and the furniture for £600 in Mr. and Mrs. Knight's name. But it was said to be worth much more than that, with a huge dining table seating 32, antique lounge suite, lavish curtains, etc. I'm just showing pictures of the remnants now. That is what? Helene, is that your mum?
Yes, that was my mother when we bought the property in 1979. That's how it was. Just like that.
Yeah. The Queensland Insurance Company paid Knight, who in turn presumably paid his debts to Mrs. Sanford, and to local tradespeople. There the whole matter ended. So yeah, it's no longer exclusive guest house. Curiously, the Booths, getting back to the Booths, it is curious to note that John James Booth, the eldest son, came to Bundanoon with his wife to view the ruins at their family's former property, and most unexpectedly were attacked by a large kangaroo. And that was reported all around the country. So be careful out there today, all right? Hello, you got them all tied up. Anyway, the story kept going around and around. It wasn't forgotten. Here in High Life magazine was Who Lit the Fire? That was in 2001. And our very own JCG in 2012, Secrets and Scandals. So, written by Helene, who was pointing the finger, I think, a little bit towards Gladys, maybe. So, I'm going to move on. Oh, here. Here's Gladys. Lovely looking lady. Do you mind? Just to set the picture, because her biography doesn't sound like someone who would lit the fire, but who knows. Gladys was born in 1891 in Summerhill in Sydney. As a young woman, she loved tinkering with cars, learnt to drive, and then sold cars with her husband, William Henning. When World War I broke out, she was determined to follow her husband and two brothers to war. She raised money and paid for her own passage and sailed to Egypt, where she joined the Volunteer Sisterhood and worked as a driver. She had her first experience of flying after being smuggled aboard an Air Force plane. She then travelled to England, where she was taken on by the Motor Transport Section of the NZ Expeditionary Force in May 1917. She was discharged in 1919 when she contracted Spanish flu, like a lot of others. But for her outstanding war effort, she was awarded an MBE. After the war, she lived in Auckland and the New Zealand Air Force, where the New Zealand Air Force owned only 3 planes, all based in Christchurch. Going back to selling cars, Gladys eventually received permission from the Air Force to have lessons. Finally, she gained her licence. She gained a licence, but a lack of money prevented her from furthering her flying. But she did fly and had a licence. And there she is. Then, in 1927, Gladys came to Australia to undertake a mammoth drive across Australia along with Stella Christie. They drove from Sydney to Perth, then back to Adelaide and on to Darwin, and then back to Sydney. She showed her mettle by repairing the car herself, including reassembling the engine. So, how come she then is running a farm in Bundanoon for 4 years during the 1930s. Then, after that, she must have left here. During World War II, Gladys worked as a government censor, and she founded the Women's Transport Corps in her spare time, and in her spare time worked as a stretcher bearer. So how's that? She was a government censor, she founded the Transport Corps and worked as a stretcher bearer. Then after the war, she ran a poultry farm. Until she was forcibly retired at 65, she was employed by the Department of Repatriation. Her later life was spent supporting the Narrabeen War Veterans Home, painting, fishing and selling art union tickets. Whew. Gladys died in 1971 after a spectacularly adventurous and very busy life. So can you see her carrying the furnishings out of the house and then burning it down? I just don't understand. But who knows the circumstances? Maybe I think the baddie, if anyone, is Mr. Knight. He may have snuck down. He may have said he was in Strathfield. He could have snuck down the back way. But we don't know. Anyway, let's go on to owners after the fire. In 1943, Mr. and Mrs. Kay purchased the property and lived in the old servants' quarters on weekends. They added many features, including a large dam. In 1958, the Nortons became owners and had the place for 10 years. There's again the servants' quarters become the main house. Then in 1969, another owner, Philip Price, built extensions to the cottage and lived there for 10 years. Then in 1979, he sold the property to the current owners, Helene and David Jessup. Pictured there, see, just a few years ago.
Oh, yes.
So what is that, 1979? So you've owned the place for 40 plus years. Well, and in that time, tall pine trees have grown up amongst the chimneys. The Jessups cut the pines down in the 1990s, those that were damaging the ruins, which otherwise have remained untouched since the 1930s. The ruins, that is. Only the two tall chimneys and the original residence remain. You see these as you make your way up the Ferndale Drive and around to the residence. We can be very grateful to the Jessups for their interest in preserving and documenting the history of the property that they've owned for all this time. So I hope you appreciate going out there today. And that really ends the history of the Ferndale property.